Welcome back, everyone, for today's second session and the second part, I should say, of the EU Non-proliferation and Disarmament Next Generation workshop. For those of you who are joining us only now, sorry, my computer was doing some tricks. For those of you who are joining us only now, well, I must say you've missed out this morning, but worry not, because all the videos will be shared on the YouTube channel of the consortium. You can find the links on the platform and all related information also on our website, www.nonproliferation.eu. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our chair for the next session, the great Giovanna Maletta, who is joining us from SIPRI. She is a researcher in dual use and arms control and trade control, and she's also a fellow member of the consortium. So without further ado, Giovanna, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Federica, for this very kind introduction, I must say. And hello, everyone, wherever you might be. My name is Giovanna Maletta. I'm a researcher at SIPRI in the Dual Use and Arms Trade Control Program. And today I'm very happy to introduce to you the next session of the day, which will focus on trade regulation and the fight against the illicit small arms and light weapons, which are commonly referred to as SALW. As many of you may know already, the scope of the activities of the consortium and the network that it supports is not only limited to addressing questions related to the threats and the challenges posed by the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and their delivery systems, but it should also cover issues related to the equally worrying challenges posed by conventional weapons, including small arms and light weapons proliferation. This is specifically mentioned in the text of the EU Council decision in support of the project and in support of the work of the consortium and the network. And it is mentioned with a specific view to trigger a debate or a discussion among experts on how the EU and its member states can act in this field and in this regard, and including in the framework of the implementation of the EU SALW strategy, which recently the EU has reviewed and updated in 2018. Promoting a responsible arms trade and addressing small arms proliferation remain, as was already mentioned earlier this morning, an important internal and external security issue for the EU and its member states. And all of them invest many resources every year in supporting partners around the world in strengthening their self-control systems, but also to support them to build their capacity to implement regional or international arms transfer control instruments, for example, the ATT. Therefore, instruments that also aim, among other things, to reduce the risk of diversion and illicit trafficking in conventional arms, including small arms and light weapons. It's also worth highlighting in this context that the EU member states remain important contributors to the global arms trade, which makes addressing this topic in this particular context even more important. Our panelists of today will address these issues from different angles, for example, from an export control perspective or looking at the role of international assistance. They will look into how open source investigation technique can be used to counter self-proliferation, but also the challenges posed by small arms diversion within the territory of the EU. Therefore, as you can see, a diversity that truly reflects the complexities and the cross-cutting nature of self-controls and their related issues. Before we kick off with this panel, which I think will be very exciting, allow me to briefly introduce our speakers of the day, of the session. We'll start with Kaitlyn Lynes, a Regional South Project Development Manager at the Halo Trust in Pristina, Quitterie de Labbey, a researcher at the Flemish Peace Institute in Brussels, Austin Wright, a graduate fellow at the United States National Nuclear Security Administration in Washington, D.C. And last but not least, Daniel Liu, who is researcher at King's College London. I invite you to dive into their impressive bios that are available on the platform that hosts this event, but I'm sure that their presentation will speak for them. After this first round of presentation, there will be, which I'm sure will provide a lot of inputs and food for thought, there will be a Q&A session, and therefore I invite you, the participants, to use the Q&A function on the lower on the tab that you will see in the lower part of their screen to submit their question in writing. Otherwise, there will also be the occasion to do so orally. But without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Kaitlyn. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Giovanna. I'd like to first congratulate the EU Non-proliferation and Disarmament Consortium for putting on a successful conference 2 weeks ago. I'd also like to thank the consortium for inviting me to speak on this panel today, and I look forward to hearing from the other panelists as well. So my name is Kaitlyn Lynes, and I am the Regional Small Arms and Light Weapons Project Development Manager in the Western Balkans for the HALO Trust. In my presentation, I will discuss the challenge of arms proliferation in the Balkans. I will share my thoughts on how a sustainable approach requires strong leadership and political engagement at the national, regional, and multilateral levels. I will start with a short introduction about myself and HALO's work in the region. So, in my role with HALO, I support the development of our physical security and stockpile management projects across the region. These technical interventions support militaries and police to conduct weapons lifecycle management in line with international standards. They also aim to support states with implementation of the UN Programme of Action, International Tracing Instrument, and the Arms Trade Treaty. My work with HALO primarily focuses on the marking and registration of small arms and light weapons stockpiles. Our aim is to reduce the risk of diversion into illicit trafficking networks. HALO employs a top-down approach, working with governments to counter weapons diversion from national stockpiles. This work directly supports Sustainable Development Goal 16, which aims to develop capacity of local authorities to build peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development. As a region of both transit and origin for the trafficking of small arms and light weapons, the Western Balkans' internal challenges continue to contribute to insecurity within the region and in the European Union. After the 1990s war, a significant number of small arms and light weapons stolen from Yugoslav Army and Albanian armed forces stockpiles remained in the hands of civilians. This proliferation of illicit weapons, as well as the continued insecurity of national stockpiles, remains a threat to stability and security. It undermines state institutions and restricts socioeconomic development. Our work in the Western Balkans has shown us that technical solutions, while effective in their own right, are only as sustainable as the level of political and financial support they receive. Despite tens of millions of dollars being spent on arms control efforts over the past 20 years, the region remains one of the main suppliers of arms trafficking into the EU. A sustainable approach to the challenge of arms proliferation in the Balkans therefore requires strong leadership and political engagement at national, regional, and multilateral levels, and the commitment of funds from both the international community and national stakeholders. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, HALO supports the armed forces to mark and register their small arms and light weapons stockpile. We do that by providing marking machines and a customized registration software system developed and tailored to the needs of the armed forces. The entire stockpile of the Bosnian armed forces will be marked and registered by the end of this year, in support of the goals of U4's Ammunition, Weapons, and Explosives Master Plan and CSAC's Roadmap for a Sustainable Solution to the Illegal Possession, Misuse, and Trafficking of Small Arms and Light Weapons and their ammunition in the Western Balkans by 2024. While the marking of a weapon is important, the crucial component of the project that ensures its sustainability is the registration of the weapon in a national database. This provides the armed forces complete oversight of their stockpile and allows them to make strategic decisions about surpluses for export or destruction. Software also incorporates various security features for improving the transparency and accountability of record-keeping practices. In practice, it is the record keeping of a weapon that ultimately improves both the traceability of small arms and light weapons and the procedures for tracing trafficked weapons. Tracing weapons also relies on information sharing at the national, regional, and international levels with organizations such as Europol. The provision of equipment, software, and training provides the opportunity for the armed forces and police to accurately and efficiently share information about diverted, confiscated, or seized weapons. This contributes to Priority 2 of the 2020 to 2025 EU Action Plan on Firearms Trafficking. However, the EU has stated that the problem of information sharing is intensified by a lack of communication and coordination between different administrations within countries and at a transnational level. As a political challenge, it requires the support of the EU and its member states to use its leverage to strengthen political leadership at all levels within individual countries and across the region. On its own, HALO's weapons marking and registration activities impart technical solutions that ensure stockpiles are secured and managed to international standards, and that standard operating procedures are sustainable and nationally owned. But we also recognize our work must sit within regional and multilateral frameworks to achieve a sustainable solution. Through partnerships and stakeholder coordination, we can also contribute to changing perceptions of public security and creating a peaceful environment for civilian disarmament built on justice and the rule of law. HALO works to strengthen security of and increase transparency and accountability for national stockpiles, but without the necessary political will from national stakeholders to continue funding stockpile security and information sharing efforts on their own, technical interventions risk becoming short-term fixes. In this way, the EU can successfully address the problem of arms proliferation and trafficking in the Western Balkans by using its leverage to strengthen political and financial support from national stakeholders, political will within Balkan states to secure and more effectively manage their stockpiles, as well as conduct thorough investigations and share information on diverted weapons, is absolutely essential for ensuring a sustainable solution to arms control in the region as a whole. The EU could engage with states at the national and regional level to drive this conversation, while also closely examining what has and has not worked in the past 20 years of arms control efforts. Approaching the issue of small arms and light weapons diversion and trafficking as both a technical and political challenge simultaneously, security will improve, political leadership in the fight against illicit trafficking will be strengthened, and the path toward civilian trust in government institutions and the reduction of civilian-held illicit weapons can be set. Thank you for your time. I look forward to the questions and discussion at the end of the session.
Thank you, Kaitlyn. This was very interesting presentation that reminds us of the importance of ensuring coordination and information sharing between stakeholders, and also thank you for also including in your remarks the role that the EU could have in this regard in ensuring coordination and that efforts are maximized in that sense. Having said that, I'll leave the floor to Quitterie. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you all hear me well?
Yes, we can. I can. So I guess the others can too.
Okay, I'm sharing my screen. Can you see the right screen? So only with the presentation?
Quitterie, we can see the back end, let's say. So okay. Not okay. And now we can see it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Today I will present you the issue of firearms diversion during trade, and I will also present to you some propositions to address and prevent this phenomenon by enhancing the detection, the investigation, and cooperation to detect firearms diversion during trade. First, I'm presenting this today on behalf of the Flemish Peace Institute, which is an independent research institute associated to the Flemish Parliament of Belgium. We have two main areas of research. We have arms trade and use and conflict and violence within society. On arms trade and use, we work on arms exports. We recently published a report on the review of the EU common position on arms exports, and we also analyzed the 2018 EU SALW strategy. We also looked at mass shootings in Europe and how the perpetrators got access to them in a report called Arm to Kill. With project safety, the last picture on the right of the slide, we conducted the first analysis of illicit gun markets in Europe, and we looked at how illicit guns ended up in the hands of terrorists. Project Divert is one of these projects, and this presentation is based on this project. Project Divert looks at the diversion of live-firing firearms and ammunition within the EU. With diversion, we mean three types of diversion. The first one is theft, and the second one is fraud, so any kind of false information or forged documents provided to obtain or trade firearms. And the last method is a non-regularization, which is the absence of legalization of a gun, for example, after a conflict or after a change of law. During Project Divert, we looked at the scope, the characteristics and dynamics of each diversion methods, and we also looked at the misuse of these guns. And we also looked at how to prevent these types of diversion. We worked with several partners, SIPRI, Europol, the Spanish Ministry of Interior, and the Federal Police of Belgium. And Project Divert followed an innovative approach that combined desk research on 28 EU member states and additional field research in 8 EU member states, and also 3 physical impact meetings that we organized with law enforcement agencies, domestic gun control agencies, researchers, and also we organized 6 webinars. And this project was funded by the European Commission. Today I present to you some of Project Divert's findings on diversion during arms trade. I will first explain to you what is firearms diversion and give you some examples before giving you an overview of good practices to address and prevent diversion during arms trade. So first, what is firearms diversion during trade? What we observed is that firearms have a very long life cycle, and at each step of this life cycle, firearms may be diverted, including during trade. We've seen cases of theft, for example, employees of manufacturers stealing spare parts of firearms or firearms components and illicitly assembling them at home. But we've also seen cases of fraud. For example, people forging documents, giving false information in order to acquire, keep, or trade firearms and ammunition. And today I will focus on that kind of fraud. During Project Divert, we've seen many cases of people providing false information or forging documents using what we called lying and buying. So these are people providing fake identities or forging the documents required to obtain firearms authorizations. Then in many EU member states, we've seen the practice of straw purchases. It's a purchase where someone agrees to buy a firearm for another person who is unable to buy it himself. Then the first person who bought the weapon transfers it to the second one. And in some cases, the original buyer may like to declare the gun stolen to avoid any prosecution in case the gun is used to commit crimes by the second person. Other types of fraud that we saw persons forging the documents used to authorize arms trade. For example, in Belgium in 2015, several people pretended to be certified firearms dealers in Belgium and ordered firearms from a German manufacturer. And to do so, they forged the import documents, including the signature of the regional licensing authority. And with this scheme, the group imported around 200, 250 firearms and sold them to illicit users. We've also seen people falsifying export documents or import documents by giving false descriptions of firearms. For example, the rules to obtain or trade antique firearms are often less restrictive than for modern firearms. So you don't need to register antique firearms or to get an authorization in order to get them. And it's easy just to change the date of manufacture on the paper documents and pretend that the modern firearms that you are dealing with are antiques if the authorities don't physically check the weapons. This is what a legal firearms dealer used to do in the UK. He used to, over a period of 6 years, he imported 280 guns into the UK, among which modern firearms that he declared as antiques at the customs, and he supplied weapons to criminals, and more than 100 crime scenes were linked to his activities. So who are the people who commit frauds during firearms trade? Well, they may be private individuals who do not have the intention to commit crimes, but just don't fulfill the conditions to legally obtain a firearm. These are, for example, medically unfit people who submit fake medical certificates to obtain firearms authorizations, but these also may be criminals who acquire firearms by submitting false information, and then the firearms may disappear into the illicit sphere. What we've also seen is people involved in the legal firearms business, so employees or legal employees of manufacturers or legal firearms dealers who use their knowledge and expertise to circumvent the rules and divert firearms and make a business out of it. One question that we ask is, what is the scope of the phenomenon? Well, we've seen that the risks are quite high because first, high quantities may be diverted through fraud of both ammunition and firearms. We've seen many cases involving dozens of firearms, but we've also seen many cases involving more than 100 and sometimes up to more than 1,000 firearms or ammunition. And also all kinds of firearms and ammunition that can be legally traded may be diverted through fraud, including higher grade and military firearms. The question is, what do member states do, and what does the EU do to prevent and address firearms diversion during trade? Well, first, it's important to share information. And one channel that we found at national level is that often the databases storing data on legal firearms or criminal firearms are sometimes run at regional or local level, sometimes by different police forces, and that's a challenge to connect all this information. The problem is also present at EU level because all EU member states run their own databases, which are not always connectable with each other. But there are some examples of good practices of EU databases. For example, on seizure data, there is the Siena database, which also records data on seized firearms. There is also the COARM database, which records data on exports denial, and that may help member states identify suspicious shipments, including fraudulent activities. On transfers, the case I mentioned between Germany and Belgium pushed the EU to reform the EMI database, and now it's possible for each licensing authority to check the documents issued by each member state, and that virtually deletes the possibility to forge the paper documents of a licensing authority. Another opportunity to exchange information on potential cases of diversion at EU level is the regular meeting of all actors involved. These are, for example, the impact meetings, impact firearms meetings, where actors exchange information on recent risks and development regarding illicit firearms trafficking, but also regarding exports, the regular COARM meetings. And another best practice is the digitalization of databases. Some countries have set up digital databases, such as Lithuania, which has a database where all data on legal firearms are stored, and that means that there is no possibility for paper forgery anymore. So information sharing is essential to avoid that information gets lost between all the actors involved in detecting, investigating, diversion, etc. But cooperation and coordination is also necessary. And that's a challenge because the competencies are often split between the different actors. And in addition, all the actors are not necessarily specialists of arms trade or diversion during arms trade. For example, the customs teams may not always have the specific knowledge on armed control goods. To respond to that issue, it's possible to train certain units or to specialize certain units on arms trade control, and that was the case in the Netherlands, where there is a customs team specialized on arms trade goods. But that kind of specialization is not always possible. So here, national firearms focal points may play a crucial role because they are responsible for the coordination of all actors involved at national level in the control of firearms, and they also act as a coordinator with the EU level. And when cases of fraud are detected and involve several member states, Europol may also take an operational role here and organize joint actions with EU member states and also other EU agencies. So our team is now in the final phase of Project Divert, and we are finalizing our final reports. We are happy to share our publication in a few months. So please don't hesitate to contact me in case you would like to get an invitation to our launching event, or if you would like to receive a copy of our report. Thank you.
Thank you, Quitterie. This was very insightful. And I think your presentation really gives us the sense of to what extent it's also important to exercise proper control within the European Union, the challenges that these different actors that you described face, and the risks, also the security risks that diversion of firearms can pose to our societies. Now I will move on to Austin Wright. Austin will give us more of a perspective related to the export control side of the problem. And Austin, the floor is yours.
Perfect. All right, I want to start off by thanking my previous panelists. They definitely touched upon numerous subjects that I'll bring up as well and build upon some of the recommendations I have. So I look forward to potentially working with them in the future and see where we can go with this. So my topic is focusing on a European model for small arms and light weapons counterproliferation and the dissemination of an improved internal export control system. So why do we care? I'm sure that many of us at this conference understand that the proliferation and illicit trade of small arm light weapons has numerous negative impacts, including leading to political instability in developing nations, supporting illegal activities such as human trafficking and the drug trade. It supports the emergence of violent groups such as ISIS and Al-Shabaab, and it supports terrorist attacks around the globe. And if you look at the deaths globally in the last decade of the over 85,000 terrorist attacks, 193,000 deaths resulted from these events, and largely most of the violent deaths, nearly 50% a year, according to UN and other sources, are caused by small arm light weapons. So why is this still a problem? Despite numerous international and regional attempts to control the illicit trade of small arm light weapons, the problem persists. And when talking to counterparts, I kind of like to break down the issue into several categories. Well, the issue persists because of the legitimate military application of small arm light weapons. States have a legal right to purchase arms for the defense. There's also no taboo on their use, such as with WMDs. They're commonly found in the battlefield, and so we're more inclined to accept their presence when it comes to combat. There's an economic incentives. Arms dealers, defense contractors, states make a lot of money from engaging in the arms trade, and so that's one obstacle we need to clear. The ease of illicit trade, unlike a large weaponry, small arms are easily transferable. They can be hid in person and vehicles. Porous borders are also an issue. And we also have coordination problems, as previous panelists have mentioned. There's limited cooperation at the state level, regional levels, and international level. There's also limited regime participation in the export control regimes that aim to stifle the proliferation of these weapons. Traceability is limited, and then just sheer quantity. As of last year, there are over 1 billion small arm light weapons in circulation, and an increasing number of these weapons are ending up in non-state actors' hands, which makes them even more difficult to trace. So, why Europe? Well, when talking about export controls and combating illicit trade, approaches are most effective when they're taking in a cooperative framework at a regional or international level. And so Europe has a long, rich history of regional cooperation in not only foreign policy, but also security policy, giving them the experience needed to kind of tackle this issue. They've also shown a willingness to improve its relationship in small arm light weapons. As mentioned, they updated their 2005 strategy on illicit trade in 2018 and committed to producing an annual report on the implementation of the strategy. And 26 out of the 27 states are members of the Wassenaar Arrangement, which is the main multilateral export control regime aimed at dealing with illicit trade with small arm light weapons. And it also has an incentive to control its spread. Unfortunately, Europe has been the target of numerous terrorist attacks in recent years across numerous states, and most of these weapons used are small arms, and therefore they have an incentive to stifle the proliferation, ensure they don't end up in bad actors' hands. So how do we improve the EU export control system? I kind of take a political economy approach to it, and I'm going to talk about how you can limit forum shopping, which I'll explain a little bit more in detail, standardize internal lists and establishing reputational costs for the actors that engage in the arms trade, and how we can create and improve information feedback loops. So, forum shopping. Well, it's an issue because export control laws within the European Union are a mix of council legislation and national regulation. And therefore, this combination can create gaps in the implementation of export control laws and the approach to the trade of small arms and light weapons. And the decision to trade arms is a mix of multiple factors, including politics, economics, and industrial capabilities. And therefore, this variation means that certain states will be more willing to engage in the arms trade or be targets of illicit actors that seek to get weapons out of the European Union. So how can we improve it? Well, first, we can start by developing a consensus on EU security threats. The variety of member states within the European Union means that there's different perspectives on threats to the European Union and the main foreign policy challenges. And once we develop a consensus on threats, we can then develop policy and implement said policy in a more effective manner. We can also standardize export control lists to kind of develop a unified front, ensure that we shore up any gaps, ensure that no one can go to any one member state and get a different preferential treatment when it comes to arms trade, and develop a composition on small arm light weapons trade. Often in much of the UN legislation, it prohibits the trade of weapons that are known to go towards war crimes, genocide, human rights abuses. However, there has been tensions within the European Union. In recent years, Germany has halted transfers to Saudi Arabia over concerns of their weapons use in Yemen. But at the time, the United Kingdom and France both rejected that claim and kind of were upset about it due to their geopolitical situations. And developing a composition can ensure that European Union puts on a unified front for tackling this issue. So, annual reporting. Why is this an issue? Again, as previously mentioned, there's dispersed data on arms transfers. There's a lot of national level data collection. It's not made widely available across the European Union or to civil society. And there's limited or no reporting mechanisms to monitor state behavior. So how do we improve it? Although the 2018 strategy sets out an annual report on the implementation of the European strategy to combat illicit transfers of small arms light weapons, there needs to be an annual report with consolidated information on all arms transfer. This includes from the origin state, the quantity of weapons transfer into what regions, and that way we can identify violators of this common EU position. This would also include information on smuggling and European arms found in conflict zones. This would allow all European member states, civil society to then potentially engage in reverse tracing, identifying like, okay, a German arm was found in Nigeria. The German state has confirmed that they didn't transfer it. None of their arms manufacturers transferred it. And therefore, you have the beginning and the end, and then you can identify in the middle where the lapse and the export controls occurred. This would also help establish reputational costs for violators. If a state arms dealer, arms manufacturer is frequently reported in this annual report, they can be a kind of this naming and shaming game as seen as a regular violator, and therefore kind of encourage them to identify gaps in their system and improve and implement best practices. You can also establish an enforcement mechanism. Now, this is going to be up to the European Union in general if they identify violators of the composition. It could be denial of export control licenses. It can be the halting of inclusion in future arms deals, pending further investigation to make sure that they held up their arm in the deal. Or if there was an explicit transfer to a regime committing war crimes, genocide, it could be referred to the European Court of Justice. And then creating and improving information feedback loops. Again, this is mainly an issue because of the national level approaches and limited multilateral and regional engagement on data sharing and limited tracing success. So how do we improve it? Well, we improve the reporting mechanism for seized arms. There could be legislation mandating that any recipient of arms from within the European Union must have an information reporting mechanism set up so that they can report back to Europe on arms that they've seized from non-state actors, or they request information from the European Union so they can better identify the arms that they have in their country. There can also be 3D etchings onto firing pins. This is a tracing mechanism in which identifiable information is directly imprinted on a firing pin, which is a main component for use of a firearm. This would include the host state and arms manufacturer of origin, meaning that arms would be more easily traceable back to their state origin. And it would create another bar for which non-state actors would have to clear should they want their action to be covert. They would have to either file down the firing pins, which creates opportunity costs and manpower and risks ruining the fire pins, which makes the arm unusable. Or they would have to buy replacement firing pins, which is, again, it's another economic disincentive from ruining the 3D etchings. Could also encourage the use of iArms and iTrace, iArms being an Interpol project and iTrace a European German project, which aims to provide more open source information on the illicit trade, allowing civil society and states to kind of engage in these research projects to identify gaps in current systems. And mandate automatic arms data transfers to the EU database, ensuring that every single member state has access to the same information and knowledge of where weapons are going and potentially what weapons their armed forces could be experiencing in these regions should they be diverted to non-state actors' hands. And then how do we disseminate this model? How can Europe encourage or raise the bar on export controls? Well, Europe could potentially incorporate export control criteria in trade agreements or arms deals. This would mean that the country in which is signing a deal with the European Union has to recognize the EU's export control list and abide by re-exportation restrictions, ensuring that if they receive these weapons, they do not re-export it to another state or a bad actor. There could be also obligations to report smuggled arms and include an enforcement clause in which further arms transfers are halted until the EU can investigate how some of their weapons ended up in the wrong hands, or it could end up in the canceling of the deal should the violation be egregious enough. Next, European Union can increase its capacity building for states in conflict zones. Most of the time, when we look at export controls or we look at the Wassenaar arrangement, it is states that engage in the trade and there's limited engagement from developing or underdeveloped states. And therefore, the EU can develop working groups to establish connections with these states, understand and explain to them where they can make improvements, what issues do they have, and kind of provide subject matter expertise and legal counseling on how to develop or encourage best practices of export controls, and also develop information reporting mechanisms so that these states typically ravaged by small arms trade can report back to the European Union. So, of course, with any model, you're going to have challenges. You're going to have the sovereignty concerns from EU members. It's going to be also a difficult standardizing security concerns. You're going to have pushback from industry because the arms control industry is very lucrative. Hundreds of millions, billions of dollars on the line. And so any restrictions could hurt their bottom line. Cost of tracing efforts and inability to guarantee identification. At this point, roughly only 13% of smuggled arms are able to trace back to the origins, according to the UN. And then it's going to be difficult ensuring that the foreign partners have the capabilities to enforce similar regulations. And the EU is going to have to face some international perception as a bully. There's a long history of Western states implementing their standards on developing nations and kind of being unfair. However, in this instance, I believe that this is a righteous cause and one that the EU should engage in. So in conclusion, we have this issue because there's dispersed data and collaboration limitation creates gaps. We need to encourage collaboration across the European Union and ensure that everyone has access to the data needed to report and research the illicit trade of small and light weapons. The EU should encourage developing nations to join export control regimes such as the Wassenaar Arrangement. Capacity building is important. We need to make sure that the states that receive arms or are victims of the small arms trade have the ability and capacity to enforce their own laws and international law. Cooperation, a lot of talk has been between the EU and the UK on dual use components. However, it'd be very interesting to see the relationship on small and light weapons, especially because the UK became the second largest arms trafficker in general in 2019. And Europe's not the only one. There are other states that need to do their role. As an American, I know that it can be kind of hypocritical for me telling Europe, do better, when the US is the largest arms trafficker in the world. And you also have China and Russia. However, the model put forth is an opportunity for Europe to go about on its own without relying on international partners if it wants to raise the bar on export controls and combat illicit trade. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Austin. I think this was a nice complement to what we have discussed so far, and a reminder that the diversion starts at some point, and illicit trafficking starts at some point. So it's important to exercise effective control on the supply side in the first place. But now let's move on, mindful of the time as well. And I'd like to give the floor to Daniel Liu, who will introduce us to the role of open source investigation to tackle illicit SALW proliferation. The floor is yours, Daniel.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me here on this very esteemed and panel. I'm just gonna pull on the slideshow right now. Yes. So my name is Dan, and I'm a open source researcher at King's College London, and I'm just going to talk about some of the ways that open source investigations can support the global efforts on arms tracking and sort of encounter arms trafficking. Some of our previous panelists talked about sort of lapses in export control and sort of the data gap, and this is where I humbly think that civil society open source investigators like myself and many others that's almost certainly within the audience here can contribute in this global endeavor. But first, a bit more about what we do at Project Alpha in King's College London. We are a non-proliferation and sanctions enforcement research collective. We work on everything from sanctions, strategic trade controls, proliferation finance, and safeguards. And what we first originally start work in open source research on nuclear non-proliferation. You'll find that a lot of these techniques, tools, and tactics go very well hand in hand in encountering small arms and light weapons. Firstly, just a crash course on a 20-second crash course on open source. What is it? It's the open source is the the ability to use publicly available tools and sort of take advantage of rapidly diminishing costs and the ability to aggregate data to find interesting ways of fusing together insights to make an actionable effect. It's about taking advantage of the ubiquity of global shipping data to sort of make inferences on tactical level trade manifests. It's about the ability to taking the advantage of how cheap and ubiquitous satellite data has become in order to geolocate and chronolocate specific events, especially in conflict. And it's about taking advantage of the open corporate registry movement that's been going on for the last 20 years to sort of put companies and corporate registry data available to any reasonable member of the public to piece together corporate networks and ownerships of any corporate network, including sort of sanctions evading or arms traffickers. So just a way as to illustrate how the open source world can sort of significantly aid the the counter arms trafficking and sort of sanctions compliance world is the Giovanna incident in 2016. A Cambodian flagged vessel called the Giovanna was seized in Egypt, originally reported to be carrying coal, but it was found to contain about 30,000 RPG-7 warheads. So obviously the UN panel of experts and the UN Security Council was significantly involved in reporting and exposing this potential transaction. And from the open source side, organizations in the sort of like civil society space have used AIS data or ship transported data in order to piece together the historical voyage of the vessel, and also to piece back together the corporate ownership of key individuals that's part of the network. Similarly, upon other actors worked built upon this work and was able to find levels of sort of co-location and ownership of certain key corporate elements within this sort of proliferation network and sanctions evasion network, and also sort of their potential state level involvement. And of course, another side of house is the ability to for researchers to go in and field documentation and bring that insight into to the public. Open source sort of data that's provided through the European Union funded project called iTrace is one such example, and Austin has already introduced that, so grateful for that. So a bit more about some of the stuff that we do at Project Alpha is to looking into specific tactical level organizations and gun running networks. Chose to, for example, a UN panel of experts sort of exposed network on COMID, a North Korean network that was operating out in Sudan. So we looked at corporate registry networks and sort of looked into potential linkages from UN panel of experts reports. Pulling those out, you get a sense of the larger scale of this network's movements and tactical level layers of shell companies throughout different jurisdictions and corporations. And here we get the level of complexity that these sort of relatively expert sanctions evasion and sort of gun running networks would employ in terms of layering shell companies and sort of use of proliferation finance and sort of AML techniques to obfuscate their sort of activities from the global community like us. So again, going back into sort of the specific utilities of OSINT, it's mainly towards public verification, towards diversion. It is that piece of the outside community sort of aiding sort of like state level efforts towards this piece, and it's also about augmenting existing sanctions and export control screenings. But I'd also want to take away key observations of the open source field as we over the last 3-4 years. First of all, is that Chinese trade dynamics are increasingly crucial to arms control flows. The centrality of Chinese sort of supply side flows means that sort of European efforts to sort of understand global trade dynamics for arms flow has to come from have to have some sort of literacy from into the Chinese sort of like a market. Secondly, OSINT cannot supplant fieldwork, and fieldwork cannot have to change in order to include more OSINT. We're seeing that, or we're already seeing that in a lot of sort of the field verification work that a lot of partners are doing already, and this is only going to continue in the future. Finally, every investigative discipline is data-driven and data-constrained, and OSINT is especially so. The availability of data and sort of taking advantage of the a sort of the openness of the internet and openness of partners to provide corporate data, registry data, and bills of lading is what is the foundation of this counter network sort of effort. And so maintaining that ability to be useful to the public is important, but also at the same time to balance that with increasing concerns about sort of about privacy, and also about sort of the correct use and data ethics regarding to OSINT. And finally, counter network investigations is the investment tool of last resort. As you've seen from other previous members of the panels, only when norms, regulations, and export controls sort of start to falter is sort of this type of work either necessary or sort of impactful in any way to sort of start naming and shaming specific bad actors. So thank you very much. This concludes my brief, and I'm looking forward to any questions.
Thank you very much, Dan. I think I've learned a lot from your presentation, and it's always good to remind ourselves that the role that research and different research technique can play in enhance transparency and scrutiny. And I think this really speaks to the core mandate of the consortium and the network itself. So having said that, I'd like to open the floor for questions. As said before, you can either raise your hand, and I should be able to see that in the participants list, or you can submit your question in the specific Q&A button or function that you see on your screen. I have a lot of questions myself, but I'd first like to give the opportunity to participants to intervene. So don't be shy, or I will go first. All right, I see no blue hand. So I'll go first. I think we put a lot of very interesting issues on the table, and I'm very grateful to all of you for your very insightful presentations. I think that one more overall general question that I'd like to pose to all of you, or to those of you that want to answer that, is a very kind of default question, given the circumstances, is what impact do you see that the current circumstances created by the pandemic is having in these different issues? Something that I can think of, it's of course how this is impacting the work on the field, like the one that Halo Trust is doing in the field. to what extent these constraints are impacting your work and the effectiveness of the assistance that you provide, but also on the other hand, because also capacity building and resources were discussed, to what extent this would be a constraint in terms of the resources that can be made available to address these issues. And I don't know who wants to go first, probably Kaitlyn.
Thank you, Giovanna. Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about that. In terms of my own personal work, that's obviously COVID has had a major impact. So much of my position is traveling the region and establishing these relationships and strengthening relationships with stakeholders. So I've been severely limited in being able to do that. And I think that also translates to just the work in general with arms trafficking in the Balkans. Given the history with the wars, there's a lot of mistrust between national actors still. And so having regional platforms and meetings where everyone can interact in person, I think is very crucial. And it doesn't come across the same when you're having these conferences online. Not to say anything about this one, but for that particular in the Balkans specifically, it's useful to be in person. So that's definitely the biggest thing we've seen this year with COVID.
And I can add on that. I think this instance, one, reaffirms the work kind of Dan does and how civil society and open source researchers, the important role that they play and just using the information that's available to identify gaps and do verification. And like if state actors can't go into the field and engage, we still have this very vibrant community of researchers that can identify gaps or kind of keep tabs on where illicit trade's going. So it kind of reiterates how important they are. And I think it also shows how important capacity building actually is prior to these disruptions. And it shows, like as Kaitlyn said, relationships are built in person. If there's distrust between national actors, you need to have that relationship. Go to conferences in person. And in this instance, once that trust is established and those mechanisms are in place to share information, that when we're not able to see each other, that there's still a capacity for us to share and make sure that there's no illicit trade that's falling through the gaps.
Yeah, I thank you for that. I also completely agree. So you'd think sort of a bit of what's been going on recently, kind of like open source has been having a bit of a reprieve, but unfortunately, sort of open source only kind of like goes so much. You can sort of like find interesting leads and sort of start piecing together and invest in a network, but the sort of the real sort of ground verification stuff is still very much lacking, and it's and that's where the sort of the value that open source will not be able to sort of replicate, and so yeah, so that is definitely a bit of a hole.
Yeah, maybe I can add to this. I completely agree that the pandemic has prevented many physical meetings to be held, and that it's important to meet in person to build trust. It has also prevented many trainings and capacity building events to take place. And these are crucial to enhance the detection of diversion. Also, for example, in the trainings that are organized for customs to enhance the detection of fraud or diversion. So that has been also a problem.
Thank you all. We have a few more questions from the participants. I'll take them by the order they arrived. We have one question from Virginia Bertuzzi on, I think this is directed to you, Dan, on how geospatial intelligence can enforce and help illegal export control of small arms. I imagine that's what Virginia meant by SW. All right, so Dan, the floor back to you.
Thanks. I guess I guess geospatial intelligence as a whole, as a concept, is beyond just satellite data and sort of shots of things you can get from satellite. It's also the piecing together of activity using other sorts of data, but put it in a spatial way. So in that way, sort of we are already seeing a very good effort through iTrace, where field investigators are sort of specifically geolocating where they found where they found and documented sort of arms and sort of ammunition from various field research, exactly what type they are, and you're able to sort of trace the flow and back to certain factories based upon the markings and stamping. So that's one example. A second example for satellite imagery. Obviously, sort of the type of signatures and sort of like shots that you can get from larger conventional weapons for verification is not there. So you'll have to get more creative about it. So some of the things that the public open source geospatial field does on nuclear non-proliferation is looking at site facilities and factories and using sort of the build techniques of inferring build and sort of how they're built to infer sort of like the origins and sort of the building techniques of different countries. So you can so that's a potential of sort of if there's illicit sort of state-on-state support for arms factories, then you can look into that. Another one is that if you can get if you know the exact ship and its location on AIS, which is now increasingly more difficult, you could potentially find a ship that is in transit that you suspect is a part of a diversion. Obviously, that requires the fusion of various different types of data and different types of actionable insights, and that is an incredibly hard and costly effort to pull off.
Thank you. We have a question from Sibylle Bauer to all panelists. If you were a new policymaker, what would be the top 3 priorities for you in terms of concrete steps and measures to therefore address these challenges? So, who wants to go first? Or I'll pick one of you. Austin, thank you. Go ahead.
So my first measure would be kind of a combination of Kaitlyn's tracing work and what I referenced. What Kaitlyn's work with the armed forces is kind of more targeted. What I see as like insider threat mitigation is if an armed force or a national actor is unverifiably transferring arms on their own, and then the 3D etchings is kind of more end-use traceability, so that whenever these arms end up in third-party states and then eventually end up just generally in the market, when they are seized, we're able to kind of trace back how they went from leaving an EU port to Africa, then to the Middle East, to South Asia, and then kind of creating that narrative, and would allow the European Union to kind of develop policy responses to that. So that would be traceability efforts. A centralized EU database would be second, that has open source components and then more sensitive information solely for the defense ministries of the individual EU members, so they can conduct their own investigations, or they have access to the information, again, in case that these weapons are in circulation in combat zones that they're operating. And then the third one would be to further lobby other nations that they're engaged with to join the Wassenaar arrangement and the multilateral engagements, because with more standardization of export control lists, there becomes less room for gaps or other states to kind of pick and choose who they trade with, which lead to further proliferation or just inadvertent illicit trade, let's say.
Thank you, Austin. Any other comment from any other of the speakers? Kaitlyn, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, so kind of piggybacking off of what Austin said there at the end, one of my priorities would definitely be, given that the EU touts themselves as a leader in multilateral efforts and as a leader in transparency on arms control as well, using that position to shore up funding to see all of these problems through until the end. And then also with that, as I mentioned in my presentation, the political engagement aspect, that if there isn't any political will, there might be the legislation, there might be the equipment, but after implementers such as Halo leaves, or these nations have joined the EU, if there's not a priority to fund personnel to actually do the marking, it's going to fall through. And then my third priority would be just both a diversification of both implementers and forums for speaking on these issues, such as I'm thinking having more feedback loops, I guess, between the research and policy communities with practitioners to constantly kind of reinforcing both the policy and what's happening on the ground. And then that also would lead to a diversification of implementers as well.
Thank you, Kaitlyn. Any other wish list from the other speakers? Or we can also move on to the next question otherwise.
I'll throw in one. I guess sort of one for me would be looking at a holistic way of engaging Chinese authorities on the issue. Historically, sort of EU engagement with China on arms control have always been sort of a relatively low-level dialogue, and also specifically on small arms light weapons has been sort of relatively light touch. We know that sort of in sort of field reports from South Sudan is that a lot of the sort of the ammunition are coming from Chinese stamped ammunition, and also sort of componentry from a lot of sort of conflict zones in Yemen, especially around UAV, have eventually sort of Chinese avionics and components. So their centrality in the global supply chain from a demand side is something that sort of, as responsible actors in the EU, we have to sort of figure out a way to engage and sort of entice Chinese authorities to look in hardening their export control of regulations and strengthening their capacity in enforcement as well.
And maybe I can also give my ideas. So for me, the first priority would be to improve the understanding of what happens with small arms and light weapons when they circulate on the illicit in the illicit sphere. What happens between the point where a legal firearms becomes illegal and the point when a firearm is seized or retrieved from a crime scene that can happen several months or several years later, and that's important to know what were the whereabouts of these weapons. Another important point would be to increase information sharing and on such trafficking schemes, and also cooperation mechanisms between all the European stakeholders, but also with the European neighborhoods. And my last idea would be to secure and safeguard the illicit markets, so to prevent the diversion of arms during the legal trade in firearms, and to prevent the illicit trafficking of these firearms, and to prevent unauthorized access to such firearms.
Thank you all again for your inputs. We have a question that I see in the chat function from Federica. And I think, again, this is for Dan. And it's about to what extent the findings of your research or other institute that use similar technique are shared with the law enforcement, and what's the level of cooperation and coordination between researchers and the enforcement community or actors. And I think this also ties to the other question that we have received, and something that I was also thinking about, meaning the role and the actual impact of this research, because we have, for example, I don't know if you have followed this issue, but as Austin reminded us before, some EU member states have decided to not adopt a restrictive export control policies towards certain countries that are in conflict and that have been allegedly violated IHL in conflict zones. And these have generated also court cases, including in the UK, where also the role of open sources and research was also put into question. So my question, and also that ties with Federica's question, is to where do you see the impact of this research in this regard, the role that can be played by these actors, and the actual concrete cooperation with enforcement authorities. And the next question, which is directed to Austin, from Thomas Brown, it's to what extent, still remaining more or less in this framework, in this issue, to what extent do you think that the divergent approaches that EU member states have adopted in response to the conflict in Yemen have risk or have undermined the interpretation of the EU common position? So I would first start with Dan, and then Austin can also take this question because we are also running a bit out of time.
Okay, so the two essential components of sharing and impact. So in terms of sharing, so open source researchers like us, obviously I can't speak for every sort of everyone in the field, but we do sort of look to collaborate with when it is appropriate and when sort of when ethics and mandate allow. If you're so as a open source researcher is just effectively is any other reasonable member of the public, and so it's if you've I would like to think that if you are an open source researcher that has information that has sort of like aggregated information that sort of specifically spell out wrongdoing, and that you would be able to sort of look to higher enforcement authorities for tipping or tip queuing or verification. So and in terms, and this kind of comes back to the second question about impact, which is sort of I think what you're suggesting is sort of like strategic litigation or sort of the evidentiary standard of open source in strategic litigation, and so that is an increasingly developing field. I think because of the approach and the techniques of open source, while has always been around, it hasn't been fully sort of realized as a community of practice, and therefore sort of a level of authoritation as expert witnesses. I guess also there's also a lot to do from the open source side in their ability to forensically archive cases or of IHL violations, and also wrongdoing, to ensure that sort of the open source technique or the presentation of open source information isn't sort of a form or a vector towards disinformation and sort of clouding the waters.
Austin, please, again.
Yeah, so the question regarding the composition, short answer, severely undermines it, and it puts it at odds with the Europeans' approach to firearms in general. when it comes to individual arms sales, that's more regulated at an EU-wide level. However, when it comes to arms transfers, they're typically classified as war materials, and therefore they're the individual member states' right to conduct war as it sees fit. And it puts it at odds with the composition, because the European Union is saying, like, hey, we will not engage or transfer arms to anything that's used in war crimes, human rights violations. But it's not the European Union that's transferring these weapons. It's the member states. And so you kind of have this mixed signaling saying, okay, the EU's policy isn't that we will not transfer weapons used in war crimes. It's we will not transfer weapons to states who conduct war crimes within their own borders. So if you're doing it outside it, then maybe we can get away with it. And so then you kind of create this supply-demand issue. It's like you have European states willing to supply weapons, and then because there's not a unified front, you have outside states, outside actors creating demand and knowing that they can go to the European Union and say, or members of the European Union say, like, we need arms for this, and kind of goes around it. And generally, I believe that it undermines other EU-wide tenets or convictions saying that we will not do X, when it's like, well, your human rights obligation, one of the most steadfast and I think agreeable tenets of the European Union when it comes to security issues, isn't being fully enforced. So why should we believe that another element that's less strategic value should also be enforced? So I definitely think it raises issues, and I believe it starts with the European Union identifying or reclassifying what it identifies as war materials.
Thank you, Austin and Dan. We are running a bit out of time, and I'm sad to say that we have to draw this session to a closure. I'd really like to thank all of you for your very insightful presentations and for being with us today. Thank the participants for their very interesting questions and the organizers for putting this panel together. I'd like to convey a round of virtual applause to all of you, and I really hope that will be the chance to meet in person at some point, and in any case to stay in touch. For me, it was also a very good occasion for meeting my peers. Having said that, a bit of housekeeping. The next session will be the last session of the day, if I'm not mistaken, and will be convened at 3:40. So we'll have a bit of a break in between. Thank you again, and bye.